This is the Mobile Home Park Lawyer Podcast with Ferd Neiman. If you're looking to generate wealth and passive income in the lucrative world of mobile home parks, you're in the right place. You'll discover solutions to the common legal and operational pitfalls and how to optimize parks to maximize income. Your host is in the trenches. He's a real estate attorney, financial analyst, and mobile home park investor and operator. Now, let's turn it over to Ferd Neiman.
Welcome back, Mobile Home Park Nation. Ferd Neiman here again today with another episode of the Mobile Home Park Lawyer Podcast. Got another great guest for you. You've probably seen this guy on LinkedIn and other social media. He's one of the preeminent LP, limited partner advisors out there. Really excited to have him on the show. Thanks for coming on, Aleksey. I'll let you pronounce your last name to save me the embarrassment. But thanks for coming on, and maybe tell our guests who don't know you a little bit about your background.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. In terms of background, did all types of investing, worked at a public real estate investment trust, had a lot of fun there and left on my own. And more recently, I am, as you said, advising LPs, both future LPs looking into new transactions and also existing LPs, some of which are, they might be experiencing capital calls, or there's some option, for example, to get bought out or something like that, and they need some feedback.
Okay, great. So maybe to start off, maybe give us a little bit of, what you're seeing in the industry right now, real estate investment in general, not just mobile home parks, but apartment storage, other deals. What are some things that challenges LPs are facing, and how can they remedy them, and or how can they avoid those challenges in the next deal?
Just to be clear, the question is, what challenges GPs are facing today, right?
Yeah, what GPs are facing, and then and that obviously impacts
and obviously
LPs.
The LPs. Yeah, sure. I mean, look, I think the biggest one, the biggest two, I would say, is floating rate debt, right? Floating rate debt. Typically, I mean, in some cases they didn't buy a rate cap. In some cases they were smart and they did. And out of those cases, many of them were smart and they bought 2 years. And even then, we're 2 years later, and some of those rate caps are expiring, and it is very costly to get a new one. And so I think that's probably the number one cause. Number two cause is, even if you went into property with fixed rate debt, cap rates have moved, right? So valuations have changed. I think many times when I look at comps, right, in a new deck, there's always a question of, not in every asset class, not every geography, but in very many, the question isn't whether it's a discount to your comps. The question should be, how much of a discount is fair, right? Because it's a trailing number, and it trails rates that at least I can't predict whether they're going to come back again. So yeah, I think those two are the biggest things, the biggest challenges right now.
Okay, now could you give us a brief 101 on what a rate cap is? Because some of our audience may not understand how that works, and it's typically not common on longer term debt like 5-year, but on maybe a 2-year or 3-year loan. Can you maybe give us a summary on that?
Sure. So a lot of them were very popular in 2020, 2021. It's essentially the same loan that you would get that's fixed. So I guess to make it very practical, like when you buy a house, you'll get a 30-year loan, and many times it's fixed. Sometimes you could get a floating rate loan, right? And there's pros and cons, and obviously if rates drop, that's good for you. If rates go up, that's bad for you. Same exact principle in commercial. And that's what happened. So in 2020, 2021, many people took floating rate loans. Sometimes they're called bridge loans. Many times those were loans for sort of like the value add aspect of a deal, and they have a lot of benefits. For example, like they're more flexible. Many of them don't have like any prepay penalties, or maybe they're not as significant, right? So they're just a more flexible structure many times. And and again, some GPs were very smart, and they said, look, I'm going to get a floating rate loan, but just to be safe, I'm going to hedge and get an interest rate cap. An interest rate cap is essentially something that hedges the risk of your floating rate loan floating, like it floating up, right, in the wrong direction, so to speak. And so if the rate starts rising, the other side of that interest rate cap transaction, like the transaction is between you and another party, so the other party bears that risk. And in order to compensate them to take on that risk, you pay them something up front.
Right. So kind of like, so if I'm buying a deal and I've got a, 2-3 years ago and I got a 4% loan, but it's only a 2-year loan, and if it could go up to 8, I'm screwed. So I'll pay a premium, say $100,000, and that'll allow me that at the end of the 2 years, if rates are 8, I got a cap at 6, and I can extend my loan or kind of refinance at a 6 instead of at the new market of 8.
So slightly different, I think. So typically, just in your example, the interest rate cap will sort of save you in that 2-year period, right? So meaning like if, for just to give you a practical example, so you have a 5-year loan, right? You got an interest rate cap for 2 years. And so what that helps you with is if interest rates move in those 2 years, then that risk is bared by another party. In other words, like your payments do not change, and you're in a great place, basically. The challenges we're facing now is that 2-year mark is over. And in order to buy another interest rate cap, it's very, very expensive to do so, because now like no one wants to bear that risk relative to the rate that you had before, right? Or if they do, it's just I mean, insanely expensive, right, for you to purchase or convince someone to do that. And then the other alternative, right, if you don't buy an interest rate cap, the alternative is you don't buy an interest rate cap. And if you don't, then your loan was floating this entire time. This 2-year period, it was floating. You were just not paying that extra interest. All of a sudden, the interest rate cap expires, and now and I mean, in some cases, your payment, I mean, at least doubled, in some cases tripled, right? It just depends on sort of like where you locked and whatever. But that cash flow can't be generated from thin air. You know what I'm saying? Like many times the property just can't pay that additional debt service. And so that means you can't distribute cash flow to your investors. That means typically you need some sort of capital call, right? Because otherwise you can't make your debt payments anymore. It's kind of like an either or.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's helpful. I know that's been more common in the apartment industry the last few years than in mobile home parks. I don't see it as much. Some of my clients do it. Personally, I've never had floating rate debt, so I haven't really got into the weeds as much, but I know it's causing issues. And you mentioned cap calls. So I'm an LP in some deals right now that are having cap calls. So how would you give, in general, would you advise me to evaluate whether or not I should answer the call or choose not to? And then if not enough of us do, what is your general opinion on member loans versus some form of preferred debt, et cetera, to solve that capital stack shortage?
Yeah, there's a few things I would recommend. I mean, this is a funny place to start, but I think the first question is, do you have the money? I've had some people call me about capital calls, and like they're like borrowing from grandma.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds like I'm joking, but I'm not. Like I actually have had these conversations. Or for example, they want to borrow from their 401k, but if they do that, you have to pay it back with 8% interest or whatever it is. And then what that basically means is it's not just free money sitting around earning you 5%. It's actually the opposite, right? Meaning you need to make 8% on the money that's going out in order to just be neutral, right? And so that just makes it a higher hurdle that is much more difficult to cross in terms of actually making that decision. I think the other things that come to mind, and I see this a lot, is in my mind the first question is, does this capital call solve the problem, right? Many times, I mean, this sounds bad, but I think it's true 50% of the time, if not more. The answer is it doesn't. So for example, most of the capital calls I see are situations where the GP says, hey, like we need to buy an interest rate cap, right? Um, and you know, you're like, okay, cool, I'm gonna contribute money, and we bought an interest rate cap. A year later, the GP reaches out again and they're like, hey, the debt is maturing and we can't refi. It has to be cash in refi as opposed to cash out refi. And then people are like, wait, what do you mean? Like, I just gave you money.
Right.
Like, didn't you know about this a year ago? And the answer is, yeah, they did. Right. I think a big part of this is like, to the extent possible, obviously you can't predict everything, but like the beautiful thing about real estate and the capital structure is it's generally pretty simple, generally. And you know of your maturities ahead of time. You know when your rate cap is expiring, you know when your debt is expiring, and you know, obviously maybe some partners will work with you or whatever. But as an LP, you should assume that they won't, just to see like what capital needs will arise. And so the first question, in a sense, after just, or I guess maybe the second question, first being, do you have cash? But the second question is, does it actually solve the problem, or this is just one of several capital calls that are coming? Does that make sense?
Yeah, is it just the GP in that example kicking the can down the road,
Right.
praying that interest rates will go down, and it's essentially gambling to some degree.
Right. Well, that actually touches on sort of a different point, which is alignment of interests, and there's like a very big divergence of alignment, unfortunately, when it comes to capital calls. I've written on these topics. Like, um, there's the ethics component, which is very big and very important. But putting that aside for a minute, if you just think purely like economics and math, um, when a deal goes sideways, a GP that's concerned about their ability to raise more money and their sort of status as a GP, could hypothetically deprioritize your needs as an LP and prioritize their ability to raise more money, their ability to not sell a deal right now, even though they can get 75% of your money back or 50%, because they don't want that on their track record, right? Or they don't want to go on the real deal or whatever. You know what I'm saying? Like there's all these sort of like scary things that can impact your ability to raise money that could potentially make those interests diverge, right? And so to your point, the LP just says like, hey, can we, can I just get my money back? It seems like a really good time to sell to at least get something. And the GP might say, well, no, like let's just hold on to it, kick the can down the road. Like the rates are going to go down, and sometimes they sort of propose these very lofty assumptions in order to convince. Or if I'm being honest, in some cases I've seen, not embarrassed to say, like mislead LPs into investing. At the end of the day, it's just another sale. I mean, and sometimes it's a little oversold. But I think the other things to consider, just to kind of go through the list, is what happens if you don't do it, right? Sometimes that's not clear. For example, if you just get diluted, that's not as bad as you get extremely penalized, right? And then, by the way, there's also like a middle ground where you might not get diluted, but someone goes in front of you with their position. So in that case, the question is it just their investment, the marginal investment, or their entire investment, right? I've seen both.
Right.
And that makes a big difference too. And then probably the thing that's overlooked the most is, how is your existing position doing? Just, like at a high level, like, are we talking, we're like 1.5x in terms of equity, and this is just the final, what word am I looking for? Stage of completing the project, or like perhaps your equity is literally worthless. Like I've seen many capital calls where the property is worth less than the debt amount, and like conservatively, not making any aggressive assumptions, and it's pretty clear that the equity is worthless, and the GP is like, hey, we're going to double NOI in a year, and it's going to be awesome, and you should invest in this capital call, and by the way, you only have until Friday to do so.
Sounds like a deal. I'm in an LP in an apartment deal, and I happen to know that this GP has already lost several other properties to the bank, which they've not disclosed. They're out there still raising money on more deals. But on my deal, they've disclosed, hey, we're really struggling. Our NOI is way down, our occupancy is way down. It's now worth like 50% of the existing debt, which they've now blown through the IO period. Now there's principal payments, they're really screwed. And then they want us to do a capital call. And I'm sitting here like, I've already written off in my mind a complete loss of capital on this deal because I'm not going to I don't care if I get diluted, but I'm going to buy more of a bad deal. And they would look at our assumptions. We're going to fix it. And I'm like,
Yeah.
your assumptions a year and a half ago were XYZ. You were going to take it from 92% occupancy to 100. But you had some conservative in there. You only took it from 92 to like 97, but now your occupancy is 60. But you're going to convince me if I throw more money in that it's going to go back up to 95. No, fool me once,
Yeah.
shame on me. Or shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. So that's kind of how I looked at it is, what do I have in there? It wasn't a big amount of money. So I was like, but I'm like, what's the success? What are the assumptions? What's the probability of them fixing it? And then, and again, what if I don't do it? Are they going to ruin their GP machine by, having to go on the record? I don't know. It hasn't seemingly slowed them down on the ones they've already lost. So I'm frustrated from a disclosure standpoint. Like, shouldn't you be telling me that you lost your other properties? I happen to know because I saw them on auction from the lender, but they haven't disclosed it on their new deals, and they haven't disclosed it to their LPs in the deal that I'm in. So how common is that? And I feel like that, and I also am a GP, as you know, that frustrates me because I haven't never done that as a GP, but some of the LPs are like, oh no, we heard all these horror stories, and it's actually hurting other GPs,
Yeah.
So, do you see that very often, or would you say that kind of stuff is like 5% of the time, or like 50% of the time, where the GP is really just trying to get you to fund money, throw more good money in a bad deal just to preserve their machine?
I mean, it's definitely not 50% of the time, like 5 to 10, I would say. It just depends like how you define it, right? That's the hard part, is like, I'll give you a few examples. So you pull up a deck, and on the track record, it says selected transactions, right? And it'll show you their transactions, and it averages out to a 2.5 multiple. It looks hunky-dory, right? And so is that misleading? I don't think so, right? Because it said selected, right? So now the opposite of that is like, or the other side of that is like an LP going to think like, well, hold on, like selected means they might have taken something out, so I should think about asking them for the full track record because maybe they're being selected, right? But I would argue that would be on the LP because at least they said selected, you're right. But now, like, let's take the word selected out, and it said track record. That's it. That's all it said, and they only showed their good properties. So to me, that's misleading. That's very misleading, right? Like, and I've seen that. Like, I've seen people, let's call it, strategically taking out a few deals, and it happens to be every one of those is something that I had a problem on. And I take I take issue with that for what it's worth. It's not like I set the rules, but like that's one of the biggest reasons why I started this business is I realized that the marketplace is just super opaque, right? There could be an LP right now that I'm advising that is looking at the deck of your GP that you just described, and they have no idea that one of their deals has a capital call, and three of them, I'm just making that number up, three of them already foreclosed or are on the auction list. So the question is, how do we get that information to the LP? That's sort of like the driving force behind my business. And the answer is that, it takes a lot of work, but I am slowly trying to fix it.
Are you trying to build like a database almost for like public disclosure, or just, not that you want to make it public for everybody, but how do you go about doing that? Just you researching track records?
So there is, I mean, so first of all, just from my work, right? For example, if you came to me and said, hey, can you help me with a capital call, right? So that information, obviously I'll sit there and help you, but I also know that GP had a capital call.
Right.
And if another LP comes to me about this GP a year later, so I'll have that information in my database. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, no, it sounds great. I want to get your opinion on co-GPs and feeder funds, and maybe just a brief 101 on the distinction, and then how how you feel about that. I know there's a recent article, I think it was in Real Deal. I think you were actually quoted in it, talking about how some of these feeder funds, specialty ones, all military or all doctors or all plumbers, have led to, I feel like have led to some problems because of, layers of GP and or lack of transparency or lack of really understanding who the actual operator was. So I'm curious if you think do those feeder funds have a positive role in the industry or negative, or depends on the deal?
I'll start with the last question first. I genuinely think it depends. I think there are some feeder funds and fund of funds. They're slightly different things, but kind of operate similarly. There are some that I think are good for the industry, and I think some are not so good for the industry. I think the folks in that seat probably don't like me saying that. But I think as an LP, the question, first of all, I mean, let me just be clear. So when an LP gets a deal from a feeder fund or a fund of funds, the first question should always be, how are you making money? Like every single direction. Like, are you a piece of the promote? Are you making money on my investment? Meaning like some sort of placement fee or whatever. And you have to, as an LP, you have to keep in mind that this is on top of whatever fee you're paying to the GP, the ultimate GP, right? And the next question is, well, it's okay if you're paying, like everyone pays if they get value, right?
Right.
So then the question becomes, what value are you getting, and can you articulate it? I guess maybe that's the best word, is meaning, let's say you're paying a placement fee, and let's say the GP, the feeder fund tells you that they're also getting a piece of the promote. So it's good that like they're being transparent with you. And now you as an LP have to think, and you say, okay, so if this investment works out, right, then it's good for me and it's good for them, right? Because they made money on me day one, and they also made money along with me at the exit. So that's very good. If the investment does not work out, then their promote becomes worthless. All of my money is lost, but they still made money on me day one.
Mhm.
Right? So then the question is, okay, so now that you know that dynamic, which is what I would call alignment of interests, right? I think, in my opinion, the only thing that offsets that in a very strong way is like an extremely thorough diligence process. In other words, if you're talking to a feeder fund or a fund of funds that's extremely experienced in this, and they really know what they're doing, which I think on record I can say is kind of hard to find, but it exists. Then what happens is, if you don't want to go through 100 deals or 10 deals or 15 deals to invest in one, you just don't have the time, so you go through a feeder fund, right? So that's a situation where these industry players, I think, add value. Where I think I always have to be careful what I say, but like I think where things get a little bit sideways is when people who don't know what they're doing are investing in other people who don't know what they're doing, and are getting investors who don't know what they're doing. Right? So you basically, I mean, to illustrate this, you basically have a bus of people that don't know what they're doing. Right? And the worst position in that bus is the LP, right? Because the majority of the capital of that deal came from them, and they trusted the middle party. The middle party didn't really know what they were doing, but they trusted the GP, and the GP didn't really know what they were doing, but like it's real estate, so you can't really lose, and it's going to be great, and it's going to be for doctors. And then obviously, not always, but sometimes all of that just collapses.
No, that's definitely a good example. Yeah, alignment interest is key. And I think that your point on a fund of funds, for example, that does good diligence, that would be an example of them adding value. I think another way of adding value is if combined you get some sort of bulk premium. Like I
Yeah,
invested in a restaurant
for
business
sure.
and I was investing like 100,000, but if I'd have got it was a debt position, it was like 9%. But if I would have got to 1 million, I got 13%. Well, I didn't want to put 1 million in, but if 10 of us got together, hey, we all get 13%. So that's what we did. And I didn't take a fee for it. We just, hey, let's all go together and then we're going to get a bigger
Yep.
split. So that was, in theory, I
Yep.
could have charged a fee. They were just friends. I didn't, but fund to funds, if you will, or a feeder fund, hey, I'm getting that bulk. And there's a guy who's, I don't know if he's going to invest in my fund, but he represents a group. I don't know all the details yet, but he wanted to see my deck. And the next thing he said is, before I even consider investing, I want to fly to Kansas City and I want to meet you, interview you, and I want to walk one of your properties with you. Can you set aside a day to spend together? I was like,
Mhm.
wow. And obviously if he said, and I might invest 50,000, I'd probably say no. But if he said, presumably going to invest a much bigger check, but he's like, I need to do diligence on you before I can get comfortable writing you any sort of check. So I was like, man, that's impressive. You're that level. That's
Yeah.
and I don't know what's going to come after that, but presumably financial review, look at my credit or look at my criminal record or 100
Mhm.
questions. I'm like actually reading the PPM and the operating agreement
Yeah.
and asking questions like, so if that guy's structure is, and I don't know his end structure at this point, is he's making a fee soliciting a bunch of plumbers. Well, he's probably protecting them because he might say no to me or 9 out of 10 guys like me. Like
Yeah.
that to me would be really good for the industry because you wouldn't get the negative stories because it's people that are actually adding value, adding diligence, being super transparent, so on.
Yeah, I think those are good points. I think where things get very difficult, I mean, I'll just be candid, is first of all, what you're describing is not always true, right? Meaning many feeder funds um, do not give the LP a benefit. I'm not talking about their ability to vet deals. That's sort of something we already talked about. But I'm just talking about pure economics on the waterfall or whatever, meaning they don't bring the purchasing power of that feeder fund to the GP and negotiate something better than you can get if you just go to the GP,
Right.
right? The other thing is, I mean, I see this now all the time, is when capital calls occur. I mean, it's I mean, it's literally the Wild West because what happens is you basically, as an LP in the feeder fund, you get a message from the feeder fund, and it's like, hey, we need more money, and you're like, okay, like what's going on? And they're like, I don't really know because the GP isn't talking to me, but like we need more money, and you're like, well, but this is the crazy part. Heard is many times those GPs will call me first. Those LPs will call me first, and they'll be like, my GP issued a capital call, and I didn't know what to do. I asked them who it is, and I'm like, oh, like I'm sorry to inform you, but like that's not your GP. And they're like, well, like what do you mean? That's how I invested with. And they're like, so I ask them to send the deck, and many times those decks don't specify that they're just a feeder, right? And they don't have like operational control, and they might be in the meetings every week, but they might get kicked out one day, and they might not hear from the GP. And again, when like things go south, um, that the value of the feeder fund really gets tested. And like, do they have rights to kick out the GP if they're not doing something right? In some cases, the answer is yes, but in many cases, the answer is no.
No, that's a good point. I was at a conference. I think this was at Raise Masters, and one of the guys on the stage actually was talking about he was a co-GP in that case with like 12 or 15 other co-GPs, and then they had to do a capital call, and he went out and he said, "Hey, my guys, everybody's got to kick in another 50,000." And he came back to the group and said, "Hey, my guys are in. I got 9 out of 10." And then one of the other guys said, "Oh, I got 0 out of 10." Like, what do you mean? So he's like, what do I do about it? Well, now he's got to go back to his guys and say, hey, you know how you told me you're back in for 50? It doesn't matter because we didn't get enough. I mean, what do you mean we? Well, I
Yeah,
got some other co-GPs. I thought this was your deal. Well, it's our deal. And now we got to get it. Now we got to bring in, pref debt or pref equity and you just lost everything. I was like,
yeah,
wow, that was, that I
yeah,
couldn't
yeah,
imagine that would be really hard as an LP to hear that for the first time, but it's happening, obviously.
Yep, definitely is.
Okay, well, interesting there. So maybe tell me, what kind of assumptions if for an LP that you really want them to an LP really dig into, and like where do things go wrong? Is it the term of the loan? Is it cap rate assumptions? Is it expenses or infill or absorption? Or obviously it depends on the deal, but what's kind of the couple things that if I'm determining if I want to invest, should I really kick the tires on in the model and or the documents?
So I've written an article called Top 15 Syndication Mistakes, which people can look at. Um, there's a very big beginning to that article, which was there's a very big reason why I don't call these top 15 red flags. The reason is any one of these, and I'll just give you an example, like part of it is maybe supply, part of it is maybe like what is the waterfall, what is the pref, like what's the co-invest, right? There's a bunch of questions, right? And like what about the rents? Are they realistic? Are they not? Right. So there's a ton of things you have to look into. And what I think, in my opinion, is very unhealthy, even though it happens a lot, is people are like, they look at a deck and they're like, oh, this has an 8% pref and an 80-20 split. That's market. I'm going to invest. Or like to your point, I looked at the deck and they addressed the supply in the market, and therefore I'm going to invest. I looked at the deck and there is a 10% of equity co-invest. That's really healthy and I'm going to invest. The big problem, Ferd, is I mean, people might not like me saying this, but I don't think that's how investing works. Like investing is complicated, and I say this all the time, even though it is, I think in my opinion, not good for my business, is like if you don't have time to understand what you're investing in, don't invest. And part of that, I mean, like putting your money in an index fund or putting it in, 5% treasuries isn't the worst thing in the world. And you really have to be curious and you have to look at a lot of stuff to like really, really understand what you're doing. And perhaps most importantly, understand like the downside risk of what you're investing in. One thing that I will point to is the only red flag I've ever published is just one thing. Meaning if you see this one thing, I think you should just put the deck down. And I would argue maybe not even talk to the GP again. Yeah.
I
Yeah,
know what you're
I
going to
think
say.
that's
I know
right.
what you're going to say. I read your articles. Tell us that.
Yeah. So and the only thing I've give guidance on like that is if you see a guaranteed return. Because I don't think there's any circumstance, and I mean any, where it's actually guaranteed. There will be plenty of excuses from the GP, such as I'm personally guaranteeing it, such as we're overfunding the deal, but then it's like you're just paying yourself, and that's not even guaranteed either. Like, I mean, there's like no good answer to that, other than um, somewhere between unsophistication of the GP and like quite literal misleading LPs, but neither of which are good.
Right. So the word guaranteed, yeah. Yeah, I think sometimes people almost interchange like, oh, the preferred return, like the preferred return is, if it's truly in the documents accordingly, it is superior in interest to the GPs promote. So that's good, but it's not a guaranteed return. It's a
No,
preferred
and I
return.
would say, if you take the population of like 2020, 2021 deals, um, I mean, I'm not sure what the number is for, but if we just talk about like retail investments, what percent of pref deals have stopped their distributions as of today? I mean, it's got to be at least 25%, and I would be not shocked if it's like 50. It's high. It's very high.
Yeah.
And so then people are like, what do you mean it's preferred? Well, and many LPs will come to me and be like, well, it's okay. Like it's just accruing, so it's okay. And I'm like, well, kind of like that just is accruing until the end. And they're like, yeah, well, we're gonna sell the property and then I'll get it. And they're like, well, it depends. It
Right.
depends what the proceeds are at the end. There might not be enough to pay it,
Yeah.
right? And by the way, I've seen many cases where there's not enough to pay it because the first thing that came out of the waterfall in the closing is the disposition fee. So you basically have like a case where
That's the
like the
worst.
GP, you know, I guess for lack of better words, like kind of screwed up. And they sell the property, didn't net much to the LPs, they more or less lost all their money, but then they made a disposition fee still at the end.
Okay, let me throw a scenario at you as a GP. This won't be the specific exact terms of my fund, but I'll simplify it and you maybe tell me, you know, you hear any mistakes or any concerns. If I say, hey, I'm the GP, I'm raising $10 million and I'm gonna put in, 5% myself, so 500,000. I'm gonna sign any of the loans that are recourse. I'm the only guarantor. There's no co-GPs other than personnel who work here full time who are part of my team. You're going to get a preferred return. It's 7, 8, or 9, depending if you put in 50,000, 250,000, or a million. And I'm going to take 30. You're going to take 70. But there's additional hurdle. If I hit an IRR of 15, then I get 50-50. And I am taking an asset management fee. I am taking property management fee, and I'm taking a disposition fee, but no refi fee. And my track record is, here's my 5 best projects, but I don't talk about the 5 projects that I'm still working on that are yet to be proven. And if I say, let me think one or two more variables here. I look at these all the time too. Maybe let's stop there. What if I said anything that's like, that's a concern? For example, the second hurdle people get frustrated with, or the fact that I'm taking an extra fee people get frustrated with. And I know there's ranges of market. I read your 15 mistakes and they're really good. So our audience should definitely read them. Is any red flags there? Because I've had some people tell me red flags and stuff before. And I'm like, not red flags or mistakes. And I'm like, what are you talking about? But obviously there's a subjective piece of this.
I mean, no, but like again, there's only one red flag that I think exists, in my opinion. Every other thing is a reason to stop and think. So I'll just give you an example in your proposed example. So one thing that stands out is, above a certain percent, you're gonna split further, right? So basically what you're saying is I'm going to guarantee you, I don't know if it's 8% or 10 or 11, whatever. And then at some point I reach a hurdle, and at that point I get more of the upside. So in order for an LP to be okay with that, they're essentially saying, like, I'm taking most of the risk, right? In terms of like my LP capital in this deal. And I'm taking most of the risk, and we don't know how it's going to turn out, right? But if it turns out really good, I am giving up a lot of my upside, right? I don't know exactly what the mechanics of what you described are. It just depends. But I just reviewed a deal like literally right before this that's like 8%. And then right after 8%, there's a 60-40 split. Okay, so my mind immediately goes to not market, right? Now, this is the big thing that many people miss. Like sometimes I'll get a DM on Twitter or LinkedIn, be like, hey, what do you think about a 60-40 split? And I just don't answer those questions anymore, because the answer of like a real investor is that it depends, right? Like a 60-40 split with like market fees in a great market with a great property with a sponsor who's done this for 40 years is like probably really awesome. You know what I'm saying? Like, but now the flip side is not so awesome. Like, what if I told you it's a 60-40 split and like there's no co-invest and there's no pref and it's like their third deal or whatever. Like everyone needs to start somewhere. But like when you start somewhere in the beginning, I think it's hard to argue against the fact that you're a more risky investment than someone who has done this for decades or whatever, right? So I think it just depends.
No, I think that's a good insight. One of my first syndications, I had my first one, I had low splits for GP, and then I kind of got frustrated because I left a lot of money on the table. It worked out really well, but it went way above expectations. So then I'm like, man, I got the LPs rich. So my next deal I had where I put in a second hurdle where after a certain IRR, I got a big chunk, the majority of it. And I had some LPs, particular one family office guy that was, he used the word offended. He said, I'm offended by the level of your greed that you think you need this much of a percentage. I was just like, you don't have to invest. I mean, but I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend you, but and he did, and he didn't, and he never did it. He said,
Yeah.
"Take me off your distribution list." He was that mad. But so it's
So
different,
this
different.
is
But
actually, this is actually a really interesting topic because sometimes GPs will reach out to me, and they'll schedule a call and they'll want feedback on like a waterfall or their structure of the deal or whatever. And the first disclaimer that I always give them is there's two separate things here. There's like what's market, right? And how maybe like an institutional investor or someone who's been doing this for a long time might respond. And then there is like what you can actually do. And sometimes they're not the same. Like in the exact example that you just gave, like someone who's been doing this for a long time might look at your deal and just be like, this is offensive, man. Like what the heck are you thinking? Right. But here's the thing, this is really important for GPs to understand, as it seems like was in your case. Like someone at a family office might be like, this is offensive. And then in 2 days, you'll just raise the entire capital and the deal will work out great and it's going to be a great investment. So just because something isn't market doesn't mean that you can't ask for it, right? And obviously the goal of a GP, I think LPs know this, and if not, they should. Like the goal of a GP generally is like to maximize their returns as well, right? And obviously there's a balance and there's some greed involved perhaps, but it's also like super hard work, and all of their hard work is mostly back weighted, right?
right.
So it's really important to think about all that.
Yeah, no, good point. Yeah, I was, and I got the deal funded, and it went really
That's what
well.
I'm
So
saying.
like, yeah, I didn't,
That's what I'm saying.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I told him I recognize it's a high fee, but I thought it was a down the fairway deal. I go, look, you can't really screw this one up, and I can't give you the same returns on the last deal was value add. I don't give you the same splits when this one's super stabilized. We just bought it right, so like it's going to be an outsized return, not because of our skill, other than we found the deal. So I'm like, I'm not going to give you this massive profit. And some people are like, yeah, I don't care how much money's in your pocket. I just care how much you put in mine. But other people will look at you and say, you're putting too much money in your pocket. So I'm like, yeah,
Yeah.
agree to
Yeah,
disagree.
and that's the market, right? I mean, look, at the end of the day, it's a supply and demand marketplace, and like um if you can raise a deal with no pref, and I mean, I've seen this stuff. I'm not going to talk about it too much, but it's like if you see a deal that's like no pref and a 50-50 split, and no return of capital, like I mean, that's pretty incredible for you as the GP. I would argue that's like kind of borderline fraudulent for the LP, right? But maybe they don't know any better.
Yeah.
Like you know, there's levels to this, and like at the end of the day, it's on the LPs to do their diligence too, and sometimes they don't know how to.
Yeah, I think it's where a lot of trust comes in. I was telling you before we jumped on recording. Yeah, I had an LP that reached out to me via email and said, hey, I listened to your podcast. I think you sound smart. Can I send you 250 grand? And I was like, you're kidding me. And I said, yeah, you want me to go over? Do you want to have a discussion about it? No, just send me your deck and then send me your PPM. And then he docu-signed it and sent me hundreds, thousands of dollars moments later. I was like, wow, that's a lot of
Yeah,
trust. And maybe he has millions and millions and millions, and it was a small number, but still, I'm like,
yes,
I don't know. But so work, knock on wood, so far it's going okay with that guy, but he probably shouldn't have done it that way, right?
yeah,
And even if he did it to 10 other people, they probably didn't all work out the same way. But
yeah, yeah. It's very trust based, and I think, I guess in my opinion, it sounds like you agree. Like many times people trust a bit too much.
oh yeah,
Um, they'll talk to someone for 5 minutes, or they'll see them on YouTube and they're so nice and so personable, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, like yeah, I'll give them my money. It's like,
yeah.
I
Well,
certainly don't
Alexi,
understand
this
that.
is good. I don't take too much of your time. Any other tips or tricks that we haven't covered that you want to share with the audience? And then if not, you feel free to share your whatever contact information you want to provide or how people can find you after this call.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thanks for having me again. Just in terms of tips and tricks, I write weekly on these things. I post a few times a day, usually on LinkedIn and Twitter. In terms of finding me on those, my name is pretty unique. So you can find me by Googling me on LinkedIn or Twitter, or X, I guess. And then where I write weekly is lplessons.co.co. So lplessons.co is where you can get on a list, and I just write stuff twice a week.
Man, great. Well, I appreciate you coming on. Thanks for your insights.
For sure. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to the Mobile Home Park Lawyer Podcast with Ferd Neiman. Ready to learn more? Go to www.themobilehomelawyer.com for free resources and materials to help you succeed. If you love the podcast, go to Apple Podcasts, give us your review, and subscribe today. Thank you for listening. Neither the Supreme Court of Missouri nor the Missouri Bar reviews nor approves certifying organizations or specialist designations. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely upon advertisements.